Welcome to the Best and the Worst, where I take a look at a retro gaming console and give you my picks for the top 5 best games and the worst 5 stinkers for the system, as well as an honorable mention that almost achieved greatness. For games in a series like Mario or Sonic, I limit the best and the worst to only one game from each series per list, just to be fair. In this video, the Game Boy Color. This was the follow-on to Nintendo's wildly successful Game Boy handheld console, and it addressed the main criticism of the original Game Boy. It introduced a color screen. Unfortunately, the screen was still not backlit in any way, which was a common gripe with the Game Boy Color. The most popular series on the Game Boy Color were the Pokemon titles, but I have to confess, I was born about 5 years too early to get sucked into the Pokemon thing, and I never really had the urge to catch them all, so my apologies for not mentioning the Pokemon games in my top 5. They just didn't do anything for me. The Game Boy Color retains backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy, but I'm only going to look at releases specific to the Game Boy Color in this video. Anyway, let's check out the games. The 5th best Game Boy Color game is Clax. It's no question that shipping the original Game Boy with Tetris was a brilliant masterstroke that cemented the legitimacy of handheld gaming and pushed the Game Boy to the top of the sales charts. Clax isn't Tetris, but it provides a very similar quick and simple timed puzzle game kind of experience. The basic idea is to stack colored blocks to make matching lines, like Tetris, Columns, and a few other similar titles. It's a very basic concept, and it's executed very well. This is a great game that you can just pick up and play for 5 minutes or for an hour. On to the 4th best Game Boy Color game, Crystalis. This is a port of the NES Classic, and it's a top-down action RPG style game. The Game Boy Color port is generally considered to be inferior to the NES version, and it is, but it's still a great game on its own, and it has the same fun gameplay as its big brother, even if the maps are a little bit different and the plot has changed a bit. The game has some RPG elements and mechanics that are streamlined a little from the NES version. Overall, this one is a classic, and if you give it a run, I strongly suggest not using any guides or anything off the web. This is an excellent game. The number 3 best Game Boy Color game, Mega Man Extreme. Yep, the Game Boy Color got some Mega Man games. This is kind of a half remake of Mega Man X from the Super NES, but it's massively scaled down, both in graphics and in overall gameplay, to fit the format of the Game Boy Color. Still, this is classic Mega Man action, and they didn't screw it up. The plot is kinda weak, and serves as a bit of a side story to the mainstream X series, and if I'm being honest, I would have preferred if they had just recycled the same plot as Mega Man X, and just marketed the game as like a mobile version. Either way, it's a really solid title, and it's one of the best games on the console. The 2nd best game on the Game Boy Color is Shantae. This is a classic that started a whole series which continues into the current console generations. Shantae is a Metroidvania-style platformer game where you play as this goofy half-genie who uses her hair as a weapon, which is pretty badass. And she has to hunt down a pirate to retrieve a stolen steam engine. Along the way, she gets the ability to transform into a few different animals, which open up new areas of the game and add a whole dimension of exploration that you don't really see on too many other games on the Game Boy Color. It's lighthearted, with solid graphics and excellent soundtrack, and if I'm being honest, it's really refreshing to see a game in this genre set outside of the medieval Europe or feudal Japan settings. Oh, and the game has some extra features built in if you plug it into a Game Boy Advance, so bonus. And the best game for the Game Boy Color, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX. This is a color remake of Link's Awakening from the original Game Boy. It has updated graphics, bonus content including a new dungeon, bug fixes, and a few minor map tweaks. Link's Awakening DX is really what the original Link's Awakening deserved to be, and it takes the exploration and dungeoneering elements from the Zelda games before it to create a really unique action RPG game with a few new things of its own added to the series. A 3D remake of this was released for the Switch back in 2019, but for me, nothing beats the original. This is, by far, the best game on the Game Boy Color. And now for the stinkers. The 5th worst Game Boy Color game is Tubin. So, the basic idea with this one is that you're riding down a river on an inner tube. This is a port of an arcade game, and, well, they really screwed it up. The small sprites are difficult to see on the Game Boy Color's tiny screen, and even with emulation, you're left wondering what's going on. The real killer, though, is the controls. It's difficult to explain, but the controls are relative and backwards, and you have to tap the D-pad repeatedly in order to turn. You can't hold the D-pad, you have to tap it over and over. It's completely unplayable. On to the 4th worst stinker on the Game Boy Color, Shrek Fairy Tale Freakdown. Now, I'm going to talk about all the shovelware in a minute, but this one stands out as a special kind of awful. If you didn't think that the world needed an arcade-style fighting game based off of a DreamWorks movie, you'd be right. The game has little to do with Shrek beyond the character graphics, and standing alone as a fighting game, it's objectively pretty awful. I wanted to single this one out from the rest of the shovelware because they at least tried to do something original with a licensed property, but they failed. Now the 3rd worst game on the Game Boy Color, Mortal Kombat 4. This is one of those games where I can't tell if they were actually trying to make something playable, or if the developers basically just said screw it and cashed out with a popular franchise without really caring about quality. Pretty much all of the 90s Mortal Kombat handheld ports were terrible, but this one is a special kind of failure, as the controls are very unresponsive, the audio just sucks, and in some stages you can barely tell the sprites from the backgrounds. Plus, they scaled it just right so that the arena is a tiny bit too small for you to get further than one jump away from the opponent. This port of Mortal Kombat 4 simply cannot be saved. Coming in as the 2nd worst game on the Game Boy Color is Pro Darts. Another example of a game that the world didn't really need. This is exactly what it looks like. A very poorly done dartboard game. You control the aim by selecting a spot on 2 directions, kind of like those claw crane games in like arcades and shopping malls that never actually grab the stuffed animals for you. But how hard you throw the dart, kind of an important detail, seems to be random despite there being a charge meter for it. The sound is actually pretty good, but there's no sound effect for the dart hitting the board. Come on guys, that's just lazy. You'll see everything that Pro Darts has to show you in about 20 seconds, and it's 20 seconds of your life that you'll never get back. Which brings us to all of the licensed shovelware. Now, the Game Boy Color has roughly 100 examples of licensed games that are absolutely awful, ranging from an Olsen Twins platform puzzler to Harry Potter games. They're all garbage and basically tied for being the worst game on the system, but I've singled one out. NSYNC, Get to the Show. The objective is to be the ultimate fan for this boy band by driving them around and playing a bunch of minigames. Like most of the licensed shovelware, it has almost nothing to do at all with the band, and at multiple points in time, this game has charted at 1 cent in value. Still a ripoff. And lastly, a special honorable mention, Tetris DX. So, Tetris is amazing, and easily one of the best video games of all time. It's been released on dozens of platforms over the years, and it holds up as amazing fun for all ages and all types of gamers. As I mentioned before, including it with the original Game Boy was genius, and it's no surprise that it was re-released for the Game Boy Color. Only, they screwed it up. Mainly, they swapped out the classic Game Boy soundtrack of those digitized Russian folk tunes, and swapped in entirely new music that feels really out of place. The rest of the game feels just like Game Boy Tetris, but the new soundtrack just kills the mood. A missed opportunity, and you'll find yourself playing this one with the volume all the way down. Well, that about wraps it up for the best and the worst of the Game Boy Color. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at some retro classics, and as always, thanks for watching.